We're excited that you're with us. I see a lot of forum veterans here, but there's a lot of guys jumping in, at least through registration, that are here for the first time. So if that's you, welcome. We're really glad that you're here. The forum is a regular gathering of men to discuss real world issues that matter, issues at home, at work, in the community. We've been doing this for about 4 years now. It's primarily sponsored by Christ Church, which is one of the local churches in our area. But we have guys regularly a part of the forum from 12 or 13 churches in the area. But it's really not a church event so much as it is a community event for just guys in the area, whether they're men of faith or not, or from various different backgrounds. We want to talk about the kinds of issues that matter to all of us. So tonight, we're excited to welcome Dr. Kerry Thomas, who is well written and published in the area of marriage and family, and also an old friend of Mike's. And I'll let them tell their story of how they know each other and how they're connected when I turn it over to Mike and Gary in just a second. But when we talk about topics at the forum, we do talk about them from a Christian perspective, but we don't assume that everybody shares that perspective. So we welcome any different sort of viewpoints and perspectives into this conversation. We want this to be something that helps us all move forward and get better as men. And so tonight, Dr. Thomas is going to help us with that as husbands. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. So Mike and Gary, why don't you unmute yourselves? And then Mike, I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, and so just so I understand and others understand, Anson, people can turn in questions during the first. So I'm going to be interviewing Gary for 30, 40 minutes, but you can be sending in questions and they will send those questions to me, or they just go to the chat. You want to say anything about that?
You use the chat feature at the bottom. So if you're not familiar with Zoom and you want to ask a question, one of those buttons at the bottom says chat. And when you hit it, you can choose who you want to send your message to. So it defaults to everyone. So you want to hit that little tab and send it to Michael Woodruff. All one word, Michael Woodruff. Send it right to him, and then he'll be able to see your question as he's interviewing Gary, and he can weave it in and get your question in. So yeah, that's a great point, Mike.
Okay, so
yeah,
gentlemen, welcome. Yes, our guest tonight is Kerry Thomas, who's an author and a pastor and a friend. And given the topic, it's important to note also a husband and a father. Kerry's written 18 books, sold over 2 million copies. Just for the record, that would be roughly 2 million more copies than my books have sold. They've been translated in a number of languages. His most recent book is When to Walk Away, Finding Freedom from Toxic People. Perhaps his most famous book, best-selling book, is Sacred Marriage. What if God designed marriage to make us holy more than to make us happy? He has a gold medallion award-winning book, Authentic Faith. So Gary's written a lot of books. Gary is a pastor on the teaching team at Second Baptist Church in Houston, which is a congregation of tens of thousands. And he is also adjunct faculty at several seminaries. He's a runner. He's a friend. We served back in the late 80s, early 90s. We served in a college ministry. And so you can, date us if you want to. We were 12 at the time. So Gary is best known for writing and speaking on marriage, and that's where we're going to focus. So for the last dozen years at the forum, we've said we want to help men. We want to help men become better men, better husbands, better dads, better friends. And to that end, we want to promote real talk. And so it seemed, given what was going on, that it would be timely to talk about marriage. More to the point, marriage during a lockdown. And we're all social distancing and sheltering in place. And that means different things for different people. I mean, it's very different whether if you're in a home where it's just you and your wife, or you're in the home with you and your wife and 4 kids under the age of 6. It's very different if you have a job and you're still working. It's different if you don't have a job and there's financial pressure. Lots of different situations out there. So one of the things that is probably true is that we are all spending more time at home. And the joke among men of a certain age is that our wives married us for better or worse, but not for lunch. And so we suddenly are at home a lot, and that can be its own thing. For the record, Sherry always qualifies and says, I married you for better or worse, but no comb-overs or Speedos. So those were disqualifiers for our marriage. But so I am working hard not to have a comb-over, and I do not own a Speedo. But we are doing lunch, and I was exposed early on to someone that was COVID positive. So I had to be in self-quarantine very early, and she joined me in that. And so we sort of did the real lockdown for a couple weeks. And now we're in what everybody else is in. So all that background, Gary and I worked together, but that was 30 years ago. And he moved from Washington State to Washington, D.C. and was working with the lobbying group, and then started writing. I stayed in Washington State and then came to Chicago. I was consulting in Washington State. I came to Chicago in the late 90s. So Gary and I have not been hanging out together for the last 30 years. So I'm going to take a stab to get us started, Gary, and say, if I was going to summarize your marriage books, I would say, first of all, that a hard marriage just might be a good thing, because God will use the person we're married to more than anyone else to shape us, to round off rough edges. So don't think that just because marriage is hard means you did it wrong. The finding your soulmate view of marriage is, if you find the right person and you marry them, then everything is easy and happy and wonderful, and you would challenge that. And then in your book, Cherish, you talked about the fact that men need to cherish their wives. So I don't want to suggest we can summarize all your writing in marriage that quickly, but push back on that or flesh that out.
Well, I think what gave Sacred Marriage a send-off is that I really did emphasize that even the best of marriages are difficult. Some people think that's a dangerous message, or somehow it's an anti-marriage message. But I think particularly as guys, we have a certain respect for difficult things. It's not easy to build a business with government regulation, with competition, people trying to steal your market share. That's why we celebrate people who are able to make it in the marketplace. It's not easy to run a marathon or raise kids, learn to play an instrument. The things that we admire most usually are difficult, and I wondered, why do we have to make marriage sound so easy? But it's still, to this day, controversial. In fact, there's a guy who travels around, and he's actually a friend of mine, funnily enough, but and he likes to make a joke sort of about stressing the difficulty of marriage. And so another ministry actually asked us to debate in Dallas a few years back. I knew the debate was coming up, and so I got some ammunition. I was at a pretty large conference in Idaho. There were 1,000 couples there. I asked everybody to stand up, but I said, okay, remain standing if your marriage proved to be easier than you thought it would be. 5 couples were left standing. Now, even as an English major, I can figure that out. 5 out of 500, that's 1%. But it's actually even less than that, because afterwards a couple came up to me and said, Gary, we have a confession to make. I said, oh yeah, what's that? They said, well, we're one of the couples that stood up. I said, and we've only been married 10 days. So I think the evidence is in, and the reason I stress it is, number one, if you are one of those less than 1% that marriage is proven to be easier than you thought it would be, you're just going to get on your knees and thank God. You're going to adore your spouse. On the other hand, if you're part of the 99% that said, I didn't think it would be quite this difficult, or certainly in certain seasons, I'm not saying it's always difficult, then instead of questioning who you married or whether you should stay married, you know that, okay, that's part of this relationship. And so I think just putting that out there, Mike, sort of created an openness to the second part of the message, is that God can use that difficulty to help shape us into better people. We can be more patient, we can understand, we can be gentle, we can be humbler, we can learn to listen more. that it's not easy, but I think in the end, if we give ourselves into it, that we can become better people.
So let me pivot here just a little bit. So this is a men's group, and when I speak to women's groups, I say very different things about marriage. I advocate for men. I talk about how much men really do want to be good husbands, but how men are often not understood by their wives. So I want to just be clear that you would have a different message if you're talking to women. But if you're
Yes.
talking to men, what are the 3 or 4 other things that you are saying? Hey, marriage can be harder than you expect. Here's things that you want to say to men about how to have a better marriage.
Right. Well, a couple things. First, I'd say, and this is where I think, and again, I'm trafficking in gender stereotypes here, which is perilous. I know this isn't always true, but it was a female PhD psychologist who insisted this is true for most marriages. She said where women tend to be more involved in the marriage than men are. Relationally, they get more out of it. And so we can tolerate a less intimate marriage without the angst that a lot of our wives would feel. So it's a little bit unfair just because we can get by with less of a marriage, and letting our wives have less of an intimate marriage because we're getting ego needs met at our job, in our hobby, in other things that we do. But where I think we can help our wives, where I've really become more convinced of, again, I'm speaking as a pastor here, you can broaden it, but for me, going back to Matthew 6:33, seek first the kingdom of God, Jesus says, and all these things will be added unto you as well. I've found that so many marriages are taken down because 2 people get bored with each other. None of us are so fascinating that we can keep somebody enthralled for 50 or 60 years, right? 5 or 6 dates, we can do that. We can put up a front. 5 or 6 years, that's going to be hard. 50 or 60, there's just no chance. I mean, even if you're Jerry Seinfeld, your spouse knows your best stories, knows your opinions, know your thoughts, all of that, all the punchlines. And so I found the best marriages are those that live for something outside of themselves. For me, that would be seeking the kingdom of God. But I've even seen it with couples building business together. They're the sports couple, perhaps, where they're heavily involved as coaches and team moms and all of that, or the musicians or whatnot. But I think that's where we can lead our wives, that we're just a small life can't sustain a big marriage because selfishness just gets boring. And so if we're not building strong lives outside of the marriages, our marriages will begin to suffer. So I tell people, find your couple mission. Find what it is that you say, we want this world to be different because we were married. The gifts that we bring together, how will that change the way the world was? There was a medieval 16th century guy who was one of the first to get the Bible translated in the common language and was killed for it. At the time, that was considered a dangerous and rebellious occupation. And he said his goal in life was, by the time I am dead, I want a plowboy to know the Bible as well as you do. He was speaking to a priest. And so if you want to find that couple mission, just put that in. By the time we're dead, we want what? To know what? To do what? To be how different? And that's what I think really gives life to a marriage when we look outside of it. The second thing I'd say, Mike, for guys in particular, for me, and I'm speaking as a pastor here, but one of the great challenges of marriage is how do you keep loving and moving toward an imperfect person? The Bible says we all stumble in many ways, James 3, which means the Bible promises you the woman you're married to is going to disappoint you in creative and many ways. So how do you still love that person? How do you still want to be close to that person? For me, it was when I realized I'm married to God's daughter. This might sound shocking to you, but not every wife is always lovable, but we're always called to love them. How do we do that? When I love my wife out of reverence for God, when I think of all I owe God, that he created me, that he saved me, that he sustains me, that he forgives me. And he always deserves to be reverenced. So when I'm looking at honoring his daughter because she's his daughter, even more than because she's gentle this day or patient or understanding that day, then suddenly my marriage took on a whole new light. For me, it became an act of worship and gratitude where my spiritual life began to drive my marital life. So I would say, get that mission together as a couple. Find a way to connect your marriage with worshiping your God who always deserves to be worshiped, and you'll go pretty far down the road on improving your marriage.
Okay, so I am imagining that you spend some time counseling couples that are struggling. Is there a pretty consistent thing that you see husbands missing? Like you go, okay, I sort of know what I'm going to say to this guy because I've seen this 1,000 times, that the guy misses about his wife or misses about marriage, or, is there one song that you keep singing over and over?
Well, I kind of hinted at it before, Mike, that because our wives are more invested in their happiness tends to be more connected to the strength and intimacy of the current marriage relationship than it is for us. I think it'd be somewhat cruel when, because we can live with a less connected marriage, that we choose to do so. I'll never forget, Mike. I don't know if you remember who Robertson McQuilkin was. For other guys, he was a university president, was on the speaking circuit a long time, and his wife got relatively early onset Alzheimer's. And at one stage, they were at an airport, and she would get restless if he tried to get around. So he would just follow around, and he's not a big man at all. In fact, he's a pretty slight man. And he was carrying both of their bags. And I'm sure it was comical for people because his wife would just get up and move, and then he'd follow her and she'd get up. But she kept re-sitting right across from this businesswoman who screamed success. Her clothes were tailored and expensive. She had all the tech gear. She had that look on her face that she was comfortable with authority, and she expected people to respect her and do what she asked them to do. Well, after the third or fourth time that Robertson's wife sat across from her, Robertson heard her say something, and he thought she was speaking to him because he's the only one around. He says, "Excuse me?" And then the woman was really embarrassed, but for whatever reason, she unburdened her. She goes, I'm sorry. I was just wondering if I would ever have a man that loves me like you so obviously love her. It's such an intelligent woman. She got what was going on. And she had achieved just about everything that women today say they want to achieve. The money, the success, the power, the authority. And yet there was still a part of her that was envious of an Alzheimer's patient. I'm not suggesting she would trade places, and I'm not suggesting this would be true of every wife, but it really did speak to me as Robertson told me that story of how invested women can be in their marriages. And I realized if my wife feels that vulnerable, just because she hooked her wagon with me, so to speak, it really is beholden on me to give her the most intimate, the closest marriage that I'm able to, which is probably still way below what she would like, but I can at least do the best I can.
I remember I read somewhere, and it sort of sounded out when I've talked with others about it. If you ask people to rate their marriage, the men pretty consistently rate the marriage stronger than their wives do.
Yeah. And
so there is a different expectation or hope, or it's not uncommon. Well, this was earlier in our marriage when Sherry was expressing hopes and desires and things, and I would say, I feel like you're describing color to somebody that's colorblind. Like I do not know what you're after.
Well, Yeah.
I'm not actively not trying to do that, but I don't get it. And I do think it's one of those things where you realize that they see the world differently and they have different hopes for the marriage. And so the idea of investing in them. Let me read.
Can I add something to that though, Mike? I don't
Sure.
mean to cut you off, but this is a key point. My wife and I spoke. I'd written a book for wives. It's called Loving Him Well. And so this women's group asked us to the church to talk, and they were there. And they had a question. I really want every man here to say. They said, Gary, why is it that we read 10 of these books for every one our husbands read? Is that we're putting in the effort. We're trying to make our marriages better. We read the books. Our husbands would never be a part of this group. And then one woman said, I'm just saying this, guys. She goes, I gave him the best marriage book I could find, and the bookmark never moves. So I'm just saying, guys, if your wife gives you a book on marriage, at least move the bookmark every couple of days, because she's checking. But that also means, Mike, the investment we could make if we would do that, if we would choose the marriage conference, if we would choose the book, if we would say, I want to do this with you, that will go so much further with our wives than we could dream. If they feel like, okay, he at least is with me in trying to help us get closer.
Okay. Well, so I won't rat out anybody, but I'll rat out one of 10 guys that these guys may know. So I bought your book, Cherish, for each of the men that were elders. And I have called the elders' wives and asked how their husbands are doing. And one of them said, I've read the book you gave him to read. He has not read it.
See, there you go. And
Yeah.
she knows.
Yeah. He read the book. He didn't. And I said, okay, well, sorry about that. Did you like the book? She goes, he needs to read it. So, yeah, well. So let me summarize a blog I read recently, written by a woman, and it was advice to husbands.
Yeah.
And her advice I'll summarize it, 4 big points. Create the calm you crave. Love her way, not yours. Pay attention to her emotions, manage yours, and don't just pay lip service to counseling. So do you like those points? Which of those do you like? How would you expand on that?
Yeah. Well, number 2, love her way, not yours. What she's referring to there, guys, is Gary Chapman's 5 love languages.
You're Gary Chapman, right? Did you write that book?
I've been asked to sign his book, and I've had some people think boy, Gary, this book changed my life. It's the best marriage book I ever read. I love the 5 love languages. If he would like to trade royalties, I'm up for that at any time, but I don't think he would be doing that. It's been incredible as a success. But those 5 love languages, Mike, you can help me, I forget. I think it's acts of service, touching, words of affirmation,
time spent,
and
gifts given.
Giving gifts. All right. And the whole point is that we often try to love our spouse the way our spouse loves. We would want to be loved, and the whole key is finding that. So I think that's a good one to find out. I think this quarantine gives us an opportunity to say that. When have you felt closest to me? When do I affirm you most? Number 3, I think, is interesting. Pay attention to your partner's emotions, but manage yours. Here's what surprised me. This is what I do in my book for women, trying to help them understand the male brain. When you look at the way our brains are wired, females, by and large, are wired to reflect empathy by mirroring empathy. A friend of theirs says, I'm really hurting, and their brain goes into motion. They're looking, they're not distracted, they're nodding, they're parroting it back. That's how their brain tells them to express empathy. The male brain doesn't work that way. When you look at the neuroscience behind it, we tend to reflect empathy by wanting to fix the problem. We hate that our wife is being hurt. We hate that our wife is somebody's taking advantage of her, or that it's such. And so our brain immediately jumps into Mr. Fix-It mode. How can I make this better? I try to help wives understand. I know you hate Mr. Fix-It mode. but it's painful for us to see you in pain and not want to try to fix this. God designed us that way. So I have pled with wives to get them to see that, but I haven't been successful, and I'll never be successful because they feel most empathized with when you reflect empathy instead of trying to fix it. But here's where I found the happy compromise. I've learned when my wife is expressing her frustration, all right, I want to act like her girlfriend and saying, oh, that must, and why did you, and you felt, oh yeah, and that's it. I'm looking at her, I'm trying to mirror it. 5 hours later, I come back and say, honey, I've been praying about this. I've been thinking, what if I did this? What do you think about that? And she's open to it and often might even appreciate it. But I've found um, if guys don't understand, this is our natural default position. I want to fix it. I want to solve it. I want to help her. That won't be received as empathy by our wives.
Yeah,
I don't think it's fair, but it's the way it is.
Yeah, that was one of my first sort of learning breakthroughs in marriage, when I realized that my good advice was never being well received. And
not even welcomed.
Right. It felt, and I'm like, you describe a problem, I'm paying attention, I give you a solution. It's like,
and Mike, I could have told Sherry that people lined up. They signed up on your office door to get 15 to 30 minutes with you, right?
Yeah,
they wanted nothing but your advice, and here you were giving it to her for free on quality time.
Yeah. So, but eventually I just learned, okay, just listen. Yeah. I didn't have the words to say. I didn't know how to mirror. I didn't know any of that, but I just knew that if I offered advice that felt like I was putting her down, and I had to come to that understanding. And so by God's grace, eventually I got it.
The fourth one, let me just say, don't pay lip service to counseling. I've gotten to know a couple guys who are professionals on the PGA Tour. And one of the things that struck me, one, it's a great life if you can get your kids to do it. I mean, it's a fun life. But two, I was shocked at how many coaches they have. They have strength and conditioning coaches. They have swing coaches. They have psychological coaches that help them mentally think through things, often have nutritionists. It's amazing the number of coaches, not because something's wrong with their game. To keep your card, you got to continue to be the best 125 top golfers in the world that are competing on the PGA. It's because they want to keep their game at the highest level. I wish we would look at counseling that way. I've seen too many couples come into counseling, Mike, when their game is broken. And it's a whole lot easier to deal with issues when we think we're stumbling here. We just can't get past this. It's not as good as we thought it could be. And then you're saying it's not that we don't like each other, but we think we could communicate better. We think that we could get over this issue. If we would look at coaches like golfers do, I think our wives would be delirious with joy that they saw we don't have to wait for a catastrophe to seek out a pastor or a licensed counselor. If it's a biblical issue, a pastor's great. If it's a real therapeutic issue that's going to take some sessions, I'd recommend licensed counseling.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is worth noting, you use golf. We could talk about learning to play the guitar, or learning to be a better computer coder, or you pay money for somebody to tell you what you're doing wrong in things that don't ultimately matter. My golf swing. But when it comes to who I am, or my marriage, or something like that, we're very skittish about allowing somebody to speak into that. So I'm seeing questions. I'm seeing some questions come in. So let me just back up and take this one. For many of us, the initial couple mission is raising children. For those of us with adult children, I'd love to hear thoughts about transitioning into the next couple's mission.
Yeah, the real danger, if your main mission is just raising kids, is that when they're done and out of the house, it's sort of like the season is over. And what do teammates do when the season is over? Well, they split up and they go their own ways. And in fact, new studies show what they call gray divorce, couples in their 50s and above, is becoming increasingly common. For the simple reason is that people used to die before they were 50 years old. Even in this country, in 1900, the average life expectancy of a baby born was less than 50. And so why would you get divorced? Your kids leave home, you're probably going to be dead in 2 years. You don't have time to meet someone else. But today, you can have another 30 years and couples feel like they're strangers and they're just going their own way. And I've gone through the empty nest with my wife, although it's often like the tide. They leave, they come back, they leave, they come back. But when you get to that point where you know they're gone probably for good, I found those first few months are so key because you set a new routine. And you're going to decide, are we going to fill up our time with individual pursuits, or are we going to try to find those couple pursuits? And I would say, while it's appropriate, I mean, look, I'm able to work more hours now than I ever have because you don't have the guilt about having to get home at a certain time. And my wife's okay with that. But we've added on other things that we do together and to find those things. And that's where I think you need meaning beyond your marriage. So it might be that you really support your wife. She's been wanting to lead something or whatnot, and you get behind her. It might mean that she supports you. It might mean that you do something together. But I can't tell you, couple after couple, how when you're working on something together, it brings you together again. And that's why you want to have hobbies that are together, because it gives you something to talk about. It gives you something to pray about. And guys, here's what I found that I love about Christian ministry in particular. God gifts those he calls. If you put yourself in the Lord's work, he'll send his spirit to fill you, to equip you. And your wife will say, I didn't know he had it in him. And we know we didn't. But it's just this thing when you're in the moment of ministry, your wife says, wow. And we sort of get credit for what God does through us. If you want to raise your wife's level of respect for you and admiration for you, just say, hey, I want you to be with me in this ministry situation. Let God use you, and it can really take your marriage to the next level.
So
Mike, before you move on to the next thing, let me just remind everybody, you can send in a question to Mike by using the chat feature down at the bottom. So just click that button at the bottom of the screen. It opens up the chat window. Find Michael Woodruff, and you can send questions directly in.
One of the, not a question, but somebody sent in a note that the nail in the forehead video is a great illustration of that whole point of don't fix your wife.
Right.
I've never had the guts to show that video or send it out because it seems a little too, anyway. So I want to pick up on something that you said here. You're talking about turning a corner, transition, there's a new life stage. So COVID-19, we're in a different situation, and everybody's home more, and everybody's thinking about this more. I see lots of couples out walking that I didn't used to see.
I know, everywhere.
So there's some things that I think are encouraging, but I want to think of the person that's maybe listening here. Okay, so they're listening and they're going, you know what? I want to raise my game. I want to do it again. I think of the 1 Peter 3:7 verse in which Peter says, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way as with the weaker vessel, that your prayers may not be hindered. And if there's times that I'm sort of tired and I think, okay, Woodruff, you're the one that should have broad shoulders. You're the one that wants to love, give, serve, just take the lead and be that guy. So is there anything that, obviously there's different love languages. We're all married to different women, hopefully. But is there something that you say like, yeah, there's a book that's 30 Days to a New Marriage, or 5 things to think about to sort of help turn the corner on something. If somebody says, okay, you know what, doggone it, I'm gonna bring some new energy tomorrow to being a better husband, where would you direct them?
It's interesting. There is a book, Have a New Husband by Friday. I can tell you there isn't a single publisher in the world that would consider a book, Have a New Wife by Friday. So there's some truth to what you're saying. And I'm going to sound like a shameless huckster here, but you mentioned the Cherish book first. And let me just say, there's something about that word. When I mention it to wives, like that wife that said to your elder, he should read it. They want that. They don't want to just be loved. They like the thought of what it means to be cherished. And I found there are attitudes, there are mindsets, there's actions that we can put into play to make our wives feel cherished. For me, it was just raising the bar. Love is sacrifice, service, commitment, perseverance, hanging in there. It's a good thing, but cherish takes me from looking at my obligations to the beauty and worth and excellence of my spouse, which gives my wife a whole different feeling. I'm not with her because I made a promise 35 years ago and I can't get out of it. It's more I'm learning to treasure her. And I think we can choose to do that. There are ways that we can train our brain. There are actions that we can unleash. And I think, frankly, if a guy just got this and said, I want us to read this together, I want to learn how to cherish you, based on what we've said before about wives just wanting us to engage in our marriage, I think it could go a long way. Now, I don't want to sound like too much of a shameless huckster. So if you think, well, I'm not going to go that just because he did it. I've heard similar things about Love Dare. I guess I haven't read it. It was based on that book, Fireproof. Is that it? Something like that. And they've got challenges there where you could grow in your love. But I think if we would just take that to our wife and say, I'm not getting this to help you be a better wife. I want to be a better husband. I want to be a more connected husband. It's really going to help. I asked my wife a few things during COVID. I actually asked other wives thinking you might mention this. One of the things that it never thought of me, I wouldn't have thought of, as Lisa said, scrolling through Facebook. How many wives are nervous because their hair isn't getting done, their nails aren't getting done. And the reality is they think they don't look good, and they probably don't realize that 90% of us don't notice. I mean, maybe you guys do, but it's just, I think just affirming our wives in that area. You're beautiful. I don't care. I think a lot of wives, they do dress up and they get their hair done for their girlfriends even more than their husbands. But if we could just affirm that when they're in a place when that can't happen. The other thing a lot of wives said is just initiate something new with the kids. That the way to the wife's heart is through the kids. If you sit down and say, hey, I'm going to play Chutes and Ladders with these kids so you can go off and take a walk, you can take a bath, you can get done what you need to done, you can call your mom. It's going to pay a whole lot bigger dividends than just about anything else we could do with that 30 minutes. Although I do remember Chutes and Ladders as being a game of futility, but that's not why we're doing it.
So I want to note that there's 160 non-communicative men out there not sending in any questions. So I do see there's a couple comments here. It's been pointed out that COVID is different from retirement, but it might point in that direction.
Right.
And there is a dry run kind of opportunity there to look at that. I want to go, one of the things that I picked up from one of your more recent blogs, because I can fill this time if these guys don't send in questions. I did my homework. One of your more recent blogs, you called on men to honor her more than she honors you.
Yeah.
Talk about that for a minute.
Yeah. Well, it's 180 degrees different than the way I entered marriage. It's from Romans 12:10. Paul says, outdo one another in showing honor. When I got married, I wanted to be honored. I wanted to be recognized. I wanted to be appreciated. I was a master at doing a cleaning chore about 90 seconds before I thought Lisa was supposed to get home, right? If I was going to do something, I wanted to be caught in the act. I wanted to be honored. And then realizing that Paul says, no, actually, I should try to honor my wife more every day than she honors me. Dr. John Gottman in secular circles, I don't use secular negatively. I think, I mean, academic circles, studied circles would be the way I'm trying to intend it. He's the respected authority. He can interview a couple within 10 minutes and about 90% accuracy tell you if they're still going to be married in 5 years. Has said that without honor, no marital strategy will work. The love languages, they're not going to work. That he needs respect, she needs love, that's not going to work. Cherishing any other strategy, he says, absent honoring each other, the marriage isn't going to succeed. If contempt starts to seep into our relationship and our attitude, the marriage is dying. It's like a plant that has already died, but it's still holding up in the dirt until you see the decay settle in. And that's what he sees with marriages. And so we have to fight back contempt. Remember what breeds contempt? Familiarity breeds contempt. What's more familiar than marriage? And so that's where I think we need to go into active honoring of our wife. Neuroscience tells us how hard that is to do, because we tend to, they call it homeostasis. Some people call it tolerance. The psychological point is that you start to take the blessings for granted and you become newly sensitive to every new irritation. Another way to describe this, you get a pay raise, and the first day you get the pay raise is the happiest day you're going to be. 6 months later, you're not excited when you see the paycheck that's got the bigger amount. It's just the way things are. You don't think of it as, I'm making more than I was 7 months ago. You're not that elated about it, which means you could be married to the godliest, most beautiful, kindest, most considerate, most loving and affectionate wife in the world. After 5 years, that's just the way it is. And if she chews her food loudly, it's really going to bug you. And so I've learned to fight back, to keep mentioning those things, to not let the strengths of my wife become so common and familiar that I don't notice them anymore. Wives do that to their husbands. Husbands do that to their wives. And that's why I always see as a pastor, Mike, maybe you see this too, if there are any counselors out there, they see this, where there's such contempt, two people hate each other, but then they find two other people that become infatuated with them and think they're the best thing in the world. And you say, how does this happen? Well, it goes back to familiarity breeding contempt and a lack of honoring that ultimately kills the affection between two people who know each other so well.
Okay, so okay, so let me just play devil's advocate here. Honor, give. I know that a lot of men feel that their wives say things to them, about them, to them, that they would never dream of saying to their wives. That there feels like there's a double standard of how the relationship, the rules of the relationship. So that there's an opportunity for wives to criticize husbands, but that husbands could not, it would be a bad day if a husband went down that path. So what do you say to the guy who feels that way?
That we can't let cultural conditioning negatively impact our own marriages. Intimacy requires honesty and sharing. It's going to require reciprocity. I think if we're willing to own our stuff, if we're willing to ask for forgiveness, if we're willing to admit some certain things, there's going to be a time where I think our wives can eventually open up. And look, some wives know. I've talked to husbands that said, we've been married over 30 years. She said, I'm sorry twice. And I don't expect to hear a third time before I die. But I don't think that means that we give up. Um, I think all we can do is own our stuff and then know that our relationship will be better if there's more reciprocity here. And maybe you pick out a book that challenges wives more than husbands. Love and Respect is known to do that, which is why a lot of women's groups hate it and have attacked it. So the danger of a book like that is if they read those women's blogs, they're saying, oh, this shows how out of it you are that you'd give me this book that's so misogynistic. But find maybe even one written by a woman. I love Linda Dillow's What's It Like to Be Married to Me. It's written for wives as well. But I admit, Mike, you're right. I think the popular cultural view is that that's not true. I think most evangelical men would say they've experienced that.
Okay, so here's a question that you've spoken to some, but you said familiarity breeds contempt. Contempt is what Gottman. I remember reading his book about the marriage lab and being fascinated by his ability to predict divorce in couples, and the contempt was the worst, the worst thing.
Yes. Yeah.
So familiarity breeds contempt. How do you not, how do you keep, this is a cliche, how do you keep marriage new? How do you see her in a different way? How do you not go down the path of familiarity? Because part of me wants to say familiarity is the other sort of comfortable thing about marriage. It's
I think so.
I don't have to.
Yeah.
I'm not, look, I'm not going to significantly move the needle. We've been together for 33 years. She sort of knows the good, the bad, and I don't have to impress her, and there's been lots of deposits. So part of me is I like familiarity, but I do get this idea that familiarity might mean not special. Yeah. And do you have any counsel for, and let's just put it in this COVID situation. Okay. So we're now together pretty much 24/7.
Right. So here's what I did one year. I can even tell the year. It's 2016. I got a blank journal that had an empty page for every day of the year. And for one of my wife's Christmas gifts at the end of 2016, that day I would mention something specifically she did that I wanted to thank her for, or a specific quality about her that was exhibited that day. Not general things, very specific. You took the time, you made the effort, you did this. And the point was, I wanted her to see that 365 times I found something, I caught something good every day. And it changed the way I began to think about her, Mike, because you go through 30 days, you blow through 60 days. After about 90 days, you can't keep writing the same thing. I would have to sit for a while. And then after 100 days, I'm thinking, okay, I've got to start scanning her, because I made a commitment. I wasn't going to do my devotions. I wasn't going to get started with work. First thing I was going to do is going to fill out that book from the day before. And so if I wanted just to get going, because I kind of like to be productive early in the morning, throughout the entire day before, I'm like, okay, can I write down that? Can I write down that? She's having a bad day. That's going right over my head because I'm not writing that down. And I was training my brain to look for the best in my wife every day. If you do that for a year, it does start to help you really catch it and express it and appreciate. I know I tend to be OCD. Some people would say that's ridiculous, but you could do it 3 times a week. You could do it once a week, the biggest thing they did or whatnot. But for me, it was just a journaling practice that that just forced my brain to look for the positive and not to take it for granted.
I have a friend who would be in the 1%, and he would admit it. If you ask him to rate his marriage, he'd always say a 10. I'd talk with his wife, she'd always say a 10. Their kids have said that they feel like there's no possibility they will have the marriage that their parents had, and they both would say that they're very, very, very fortunate. And I mean, there's nothing unique. There's nothing remarkable about either one of them where you just go, well, of course, if you were married to that person, you'd say they were a 10. It's just, I've pushed on this and with him and tried to figure out in part. So how much of this is you just won the lottery? Like, you know, you guys are just, this is the one time this soulmate thing actually works out. I'm not a big fan of the soulmate theory because I think you know, we should be trying to become the right person, not find the right person. And but one of the things that this guy did that really got my attention, and I've done it, but not 365 days a year. But he says every day in his journal he writes something he appreciates about his wife, and it has to be something new.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
So he just, you know, he's been married longer than I have, and he just keeps doing it. And he said, you got to think. So it forces me to think, what did she do that I can affirm?
Right.
He says, because I just feel like I've got to train my brain to see those things. And you know, the Greek, you talked about the fact that, you know, neuroscience sort of discounts this. The hedonists, you know, the hedonic treadmill. So go back 3,000 years. Right. They said, whatever you get today that you like, yeah, tomorrow, not so much.
Right.
And if you pursue pleasure, eventually it leads to destruction. You need more and more. It leads to addictions, and addictions, you need more and it gives you less back. And it's a vicious cycle. So he wanted to fight that, and same kind of idea. I am going to figure out something to be thankful for. And it's, you know, I know there's guys going, I'm not being given a lot to work with at this point.
Well, and Mike, your letter last Friday, I think it was, that had the Arthur Brooke link.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Happiness. Yeah.
But it's good. If guys haven't read it, I'd recommend that you go back and read it. But he directly connects happiness with relationships. So guys, what we can conclude from this is that our wives want to be more engaged with us in marriage, by and large. Stereotypically, that's overwhelmingly true. And what Arthur Brooks would tell you is that to do that is to increase your own level of happiness. And Mike and I found this out. One of our business ventures that didn't end up that well, man, I'm not sure we did that together, Mike. You were working on a newsletter and you finally got to interview Peter Drucker. You remember that?
Well, it wasn't Drucker, but tell the story because that sounds better. It was.
Are you sure it wasn't? I thought it was.
It was Max Dupree.
Oh, okay. Max Dupree. Well, yeah, I've always said Peter Drucker. So
yeah, it sounds better, you know.
But this business guru that so many people have read, so many people are impressed with, and you were at that stage. I mean, we were young. How do I succeed? How do I be more productive? How do I find the next idea? And you said he just wanted to talk about his grandkids and his family. And he was really at that stage where his happiness was really rooted in relationship. Well, part of that is body chemistry. As we get older, testosterone goes down, estrogen goes up. We do become more relational just as a part of who we are. But in the end, I think we will feel happier if our relationships are better. I don't know that I've ever met a contented man whose most intimate relationship with his wife or second wife or his third wife is estranged that really feels full contentment. He can have all the toys, all the power, all the money. I think in a lot of ways he would give up 90% of his fortune to be able to be connected in an intimate marriage.
That's certainly Clay Christensen's book, How Will I Measure My Life?
Yes.
You know, all these Harvard business school guys coming back, they're worth, you know, $200 million and absolutely miserable because they're estranged from everyone. And in this Max Dupree interview, so Dupree was the CEO of Herman Miller. They'd won several years in a row, you know, best company to work for or whatever. And he had a book out, Leadership Jazz and Leadership is an Art, and was in his late 70s when I interviewed him. And he said, he said a couple things that he didn't really want to do the interview. And he said, look, I'm just not that interesting a person to talk to. And I said, oh, come on, you're incredibly interesting. And I said, I'm interested in things like ambition. And I said, I want to know how I should balance ambition. And he said, well, let me just tell you, he goes, I went 30 years where I'd sell my soul for a good quarter. Like, you know, to hit the numbers and to have a good board meeting, he goes, there isn't a whole lot I wouldn't do. And there wasn't a whole lot of people I wouldn't walk over or walk past or whatever. And he says, I'm not proud of any of that. I did it. I tried to build a culture that checked that didn't allow me to just run reckless over people. And he had wonderful things to say about employing people of limited intellectual abilities and other things. I mean, he had been very conscious of his own brokenness, but he did. He was all excited. I couldn't get him to stop talking about his granddaughter. And I'm like, nobody, you know, Max, no offense, but nobody cares about your granddaughter. She's like 4. I mean, I'm sure she's cute, but I kept trying to pull him back to this thing. And so, yeah. So we just have another couple minutes, Gary. Is there any kind of last encouragement to the guys? Can you pray for us as husbands? How do you want to end this?
Well, I think that marriage really is one of those investments that pays off. I think of what I've invested in, and some have paid off. I got into golf for a while with all the lessons, and I realized if I spent a lot of money and a lot of time, I could take 10 strokes off my score, but I have a lot more fun, frankly, when I don't expect myself to do well. I heard a funny story. A guy was playing in a Pro-Am, and it was with, I think with one of the funny guys, Lee Trevino or somebody on tour, and he was just cussing and swearing, and I think his Lee said, look, you're too bad to get mad. He goes, you should be surprised when you hit a good stroke, not upset when you hit a bad one. And like Max Dupree said with his business, things that go away and whatnot, the ones I've seen happiest are those that really are investing in their relationships. There is a very successful company in this country where I've gotten to know one of the partners very well. If you put their combined income together, you're past 10 billion. One of them is one of the happiest men I've ever known, and his wife thinks he's the godliest man she's ever met, and they're just this incredible couple. The other partner is more of the executive one. Relationships are suffering, more in the papers, but boy, I got to tell you, the happiness quotient is probably not even half. Not that happiness is a goal. I mean, I wrote the book, What If God Designed Marriage to Make Us Holy More Than to Make Us Happy? But I think I think holiness serves the cause of happiness. And the holiest people are the most relational people. And so I think it just behooves us as men, before our brain chemistry naturally takes us there, to fight against some of the ambitious urges and saying, look, here's this woman that said, I'm going to be with you. You're going to be my life. I'm going to raise kids with you, or we're going to go through childlessness together. And she's waiting for us to come home and at least move the needle a little bit. I care. It matters to me that you feel like we're connected. If we're not connected, I want to take the first step to get us connected. I'm going to pick out the counselor. I'm going to sign us up for the marriage conference. I'm going to get the book. We're going to listen to the podcast together. Whatever would most move your wife's heart. I just recommend that that's a really wise investment for you to make.
Okay. Great. Well, so we could have 160 guys give a thumbs up. Thank you, Gary, for your time with us tonight. God bless you in your work and your writing and speaking and all of that. Maybe in the post-COVID world, we'll get you to Chicago, but
love to do it. There's a great run there. I love that run right by the lake. So
yeah, okay. Well, okay. So Anson, back to you.
All right, Gary, thank you so much. Mike, thank you for your time as well. Thinking about that investment, we are going to provide an opportunity for any guy who wants to sort of take a step of investment here pretty soon. We're going to offer opportunities to form book discussions around your book, Cherish. So everybody who's registered for tonight's event, you'll get a follow-up email from me on that. And so that might be a great way to to take a step and take that initiative and follow up on this conversation. Our next forum that we have planned, TBD, whether it's forum online or forum as we know it at post time. But Charlie Duke, former astronaut, is going to be joining us on Father's Day weekend. And so we're looking forward to that. That's June, I think it's the 22nd, if I'm not mistaken, or it's that weekend that's closest to it. So we're going to be gathering again for that. Looking forward to it.